The industrial air in the storage closet tasted of mothballs and stale lavender, a sharp, chemical bite that scorched the back of Elena Carter's throat. She pressed her shoulder against a stack of box linens, the cold plastic of the containers biting through the thin polyester of her maid's uniform. Her left arm was a screaming pillar of agony, the radius bone feeling as though it had been splintered into 1,000 needles of white-hot glass. Every breath was a calculated risk, a shallow expansion of her lungs that sent tremors through her ribcage where a deep, violet bruise was already blossoming. She stared at the floor, watching a single bead of blood crawl down the curve of her dark, espresso-toned thumb before it splashed onto the pristine white tile. The contrast was a violent accusation. The gala outside continued with its rhythmic, bass-heavy pulse, the muffled sounds of string quartets and elite laughter vibrating through the hollow corridor. She was 25, a woman who had clawed her way from the dust of Lagos to the gleaming towers of Seoul's elite, only to find herself broken in a room filled with spare napkins and heavy-duty detergent. The injustice of it felt heavier than the injury. It was absolute. She reached out with her good hand to touch the hem of her apron, the starch under her fingernails triggering a jagged memory of her mother's hands. She remembered the scent of wood smoke and the way her mother had ironed their school uniforms with a heavy, charcoal-filled press, whispering that if they looked perfect, the world would treat them as such. Her mother had been wrong. The world of billionaires and shadow players didn't see the crispness of a collar. It only saw a target. Elena dabs at her split lip with a wad of industrial paper towels, the abrasive texture scraping against her torn flesh. The bleeding refused to coagulate, a slow, rhythmic drip that mirrored the ticking of her own internal panic. She had to get back to the floor. The event coordination for the Kim conglomerate's annual winter gala required a technical precision that left zero margin for error. She had managed the load-in schedules, the floral hydration levels, and the seating chart's delicate political balance for 300 of the world's most dangerous men. If she vanished now, her promotion to chief of staff would vanish with her. She closed her eyes, the thrum of her pulse a frantic drum in her ears. The door hinges groaned, a heavy, metallic sound that signaled the end of her sanctuary. She didn't look up, her spine stiffening as she prepared an apology for whatever catering staffer had come to retrieve more stemware. Instead of the expected rattle of a service cart, there was only a profound, heavy silence that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the small room. The scent of ozone and expensive, cold sandalwood filled the space, a fragrance that cost more than a year of her mother's medical treatments. She finally lifted her gaze, her breath catching in her throat as she met the glacial, unreadable eyes of Jin-Ho Kim. He stood 6'2" of tailored obsidian, his tuxedo a masterclass in Seville Row construction, the silk lapels catching the harsh, overhead fluorescent light. Jin-Ho was the ghost of the city, a man whose name was spoken in the boardrooms of the Blue House and the back alleys of Incheon with the same trembling reverence. He was a shark in a world of goldfish, a predator in repose. Jin-Ho didn't speak. He simply observed, his gaze moving with a clinical, predatory focus over the ruins of her appearance. He saw the way she cradled her left arm, the limb hanging at an unnatural, heavy angle that suggested a complete midshaft fracture of the ulna. He saw the reddish-black stain on her uniform hip, the liquid having seeped into the fibers to create a map of violence. His face was a mask of carved marble, the high cheekbones and sharp jawline casting shadows that made him look like a deity of retribution. Elena tried to stand, but the shift in her weight caused the broken ends of her bone to grind, a sickening, wet sound that vibrated through her entire nervous system. The world tilted, the rows of detergent bottles blurring into a smear of neon color. She felt a cold sweat break across her brow, her vasovagal response threatening to plunge her into darkness. She stayed upright only through the sheer, stubborn refusal to collapse in his presence. "Mr. Kim," she rasped, the words feeling like sandpaper against her vocal cords. She forced a professional mask into place, though her lips trembled with the effort. I apologize for the intrusion. A minor accident in the service elevator. I will be back at my post in 5 minutes. She tried to tuck her broken arm behind her back, but the movement sent a fresh wave of fire through her shoulder. The pain was an ocean, and she was drowning. Jin-ho took a single step forward, the floorboards not even creaking under his weight. He moved with a lethal grace, a panther navigating a cage of his own making. He reached out, his fingers stopping just inches from her chin, the heat radiating from his skin acting as a strange, grounding wire for her panic. "Tell me," Jin-ho said, his voice a low, vibrating baritone that resonated in the hollow of her chest. It wasn't a request. It was an ultimatum. The name, the single phrase cut through the air like a guillotine blade. Elena felt her heart lurch against her ribs, the technical logistics of the night's RSVP list flashing through her mind. The high-profile guests, the diplomatic immunities, the layers of protection that surrounded the men who felt they were gods. She knew that naming the man who had cornered her in the loading bay was a death sentence, not just for him, but potentially for her career. She thought of her mother's dialysis bills, the debt that hung over her head like a heavy, rusted chain. If she spoke, she broke the silence that the Kim organization demanded of its staff. If she remained silent, she died in pieces. "It was an accident, sir," she lied, the words tasting like ash. "I tripped on the pallet jack near the loading dock. The flooring is uneven." She looked down at his shoes, polished calfskin that reflected her own bruised face. Jin-ho's hand moved then, his fingers finally making contact with her jaw, his touch surprisingly gentle, almost reverent. He tilted her face upward, forcing her to look into the abyss of his pupils. He saw the way her pupils were blown wide with shock, the physiological markers of acute trauma that no amount of professional poise could hide. He knew the difference between a fall and a fist. He lived in the difference. "A pallet jack does not leave finger-shaped contusions on the inner bicep," Jin-ho murmured, his thumb grazing the edge of her split lip. "And an uneven floor does not result in a defensive fracture of the forearm." He looked at her arm, his eyes narrowing as he calculated the force required to snap a bone through a layer of muscle. His fury was a silent, vibrating thing, a localized earthquake that she could feel in the soles of her feet. Elena's resistance began to crumble, the weight of his protection offering a seductive alternative to the cold isolation of her fear. She felt a tear escape, tracing a hot, salty path through the makeup and blood on her cheek. She was tired of being strong. She was exhausted. "Preston Caldwell," she whispered, the name finally escaping her like a trapped bird. He was intoxicated. He didn't like that I refused to accompany him to the private lounge. He grabbed me, and when I pushed back, he used the heavy brass stanchion from the VIP line. She shuddered, the memory of the cold metal hitting her arm making her vision go white again. She remembered the sound of the bones snapping, a dry, wooden crack that had been drowned out by the muffled bass of the dance floor. Preston had laughed, a wet, entitled sound, before walking away to order another scotch. He was the son of a visiting senator, a man who believed the world was his private playground. He was untouchable. Jin-ho's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He let go of her jaw and reached into his inner jacket pocket, pulling out a sleek, encrypted smartphone. He tapped a single command on the screen, his movements precise and mechanical. "Frank," he said into the device, his voice a lethal purr. "South Storage. Bring the trauma kit and a bottle of the 1945 Reserve. And tell the senator's son that his presence is no longer required in this world." He ended the call with a flick of his thumb, the screen going dark like a guttering candle. He turned back to Elena, his eyes softening by a fraction of a millimeter. He didn't wait for her to protest. He stepped closer, the heat of his body acting as a barrier against the cold industrial air of the closet. In one fluid motion, he shrugged out of his tuxedo jacket, the silk lining whispering against his shirt. He draped it over her shoulders, the fabric heavy and warm, smelling of wood smoke and a lingering, metallic edge. It was large enough to cover the ruins of her uniform, the weight of it feeling like a suit of armor. Elena clutched the lapels with her good hand, her knuckles turning bone white against the black wool. She felt the first stirrings of a dangerous hope. It was terrifying. "You are going to sit," Jin-ho commanded, his tone brook no argument. He pulled a low stool from beneath a shelf of cleaning supplies, placing it behind her with a practiced, steady hand. Elena sank onto it, her legs finally giving way to the adrenaline crash. The pain in her arm began to throb in time with her heartbeat, a deep, rhythmic ache that signaled the onset of severe inflammation. She watched as Jin-ho knelt before her, a man who had never knelt for a king, now lowering himself to the level of a maid's broken shoes. He took her hand, her good hand, and held it between his palms. His skin was calloused, the hands of a man who had earned his power through visceral, physical struggle. The door opened again and Frank, the head of Kim's security detail, stepped inside. He was a man of silver hair and eyes that had seen the end of the world. He didn't blink at the sight of his boss on the floor. He simply knelt beside him and opened a leather first aid case. The smell of antiseptic and medical-grade lidocaine filled the small space. Frank worked with the technical efficiency of a battlefield surgeon, his fingers probing the fracture with a gentleness that belied his massive frame. Elena hissed as he applied a temporary vacuum splint, the device hissing as it pressurized around her limb. "Midshaft radial ulnar fracture," Frank muttered, his voice a low gravel. "She needs an orthopedic surgeon and 4 of Toradol. I'll call the private clinic." "Do it," Jin-ho said, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. "And Frank, the loading bay camera footage. Erase the original after you've extracted the frames of the assault. I want a record of every man who stood by and watched." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She realized then that the 15 men she had seen lingering near the loading bay, the security guards, the junior aides, the hangers-on who had laughed while Preston struck her, were already dead in Jin-ho's mind. They were complicit. They were ghosts. "Mr. Kim," Elena whispered, her voice trembling as the lidocaine began to numb the surface of her skin, though the deep ache remained. "His father, the senator. The diplomatic fallout could ruin the trade deal you've been working on for 18 months. The logistics of the port expansion depend on their cooperation." She was still thinking about the business, about the technical architecture of the empire she helped maintain. She couldn't help it. It was how she survived. Jin-ho leaned in, his face inches from hers, his breath a warm ghost against her lips. "The trade deal is a collection of papers and ink," he said, his voice dropping to a register that made her heart skip a beat. "You are blood and bone. You are the woman who ensures my world turns with a precision that I do not deserve. If I allow a man to break you and walk away, I have no empire worth keeping." He reached up and brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead, his touch a promise of absolute violence. "By morning, Preston Caldwell will be a footnote in a tragedy. And those who watched him will be the prologue." He stood up, towering over her once more, a dark god reclaiming his throne. Frank helped Elena to her feet, his arm a solid pillar of support as they moved toward the service exit. The transition from the storage room to the cool night air was a sensory shock. The smell of rain-soaked concrete and the distant, lonely wail of a siren. Jin-ho followed them, his silhouette framed against the gold-leafed doorway of the gala. He looked at her one last time, a gaze so intense it felt like a brand. "Go home, Elena," he said softly. "Rest. The medical bills, the apartment lease, the debt, it is gone. Consider it a down payment on the life you are about to lead." He turned and walked back into the light, the door clicking shut with a finality that echoed in the empty alleyway. The drive to the clinic was a blur of neon lights and the rhythmic thumping of the limousine's tires over the expansion joints of the Han River Bridge. Elena leaned her head against the cool leather of the seat, Jinho's jacket still wrapped around her. She could feel the vibration of the car's engine through the floorboards, a low-frequency hum that soothed her frayed nerves. She closed her eyes and saw the loading bay again, but the memory was different now. It was no longer a place of shame. It was the site of a turning tide. She felt a cold, hollow ache in her chest as she thought of her mother, but for the first time in years, the ache wasn't accompanied by the suffocating weight of helplessness. She was safe. She was protected by a monster. At the clinic, the staff moved with a hushed, terrified efficiency reserved for Jinho's personal interests. They didn't ask for insurance. They didn't ask for a police report. They simply worked. They set the bone under heavy sedation, the transition into sleep a velvet curtain falling over her world. When she woke 3 hours later, her arm was encased in a lightweight, carbon fiber cast, and her mother was sitting in a chair by the bed, her face a mask of bewildered relief. "The bill's Katie," her mother whispered, using her childhood name. "The hospital called. They said it's all paid. Forever." Who did this? Elena looked at the small, black card on the bedside table. There was no name, only a gold embossed dragon. "A friend, Mom," Elena said, her voice steady. "A very powerful friend." She reached out with her good hand and touched the fabric of the expensive silk sheets, the texture a reminder of the world she now inhabited. She felt the thrum of adrenaline still lingering in her fingertips, a residual charge from her encounter with Jinho. She knew that the city outside was changing. She knew that in the shadows of the skyscrapers, a reckoning was taking place. She felt no pity for the men who were currently being hunted. She felt only a grim, visceral satisfaction. By 4 a.m., the news alerts began to crawl across the bottom of the television screen in the recovery room. Reports of a mass disappearance. 15 men, including the son of a prominent U.S. senator, had vanished from a high-stakes gala. There was no sign of a struggle. No blood. Just empty chairs and abandoned drinks. The police were baffled, citing a lack of security footage due to a technical glitch in the venue's mainframe. Elena watched the screen, her heart beating with a slow, heavy rhythm. She knew exactly what had happened. She could almost see Jinho standing in the rain, his hands clean, his eyes cold. He had erased them. 3 days later, Elena returned to the Kim headquarters. She wasn't wearing a maid's uniform. She wore a tailored suit of deep charcoal, the fabric a subtle, expensive wool that felt like a second skin. Her arm was in a sling, but she walked with a grace that turned heads in the lobby. The security guards, men who had previously looked through her as if she were made of glass, now bowed as she passed. They knew. The entire building knew that the woman with the African heritage and the unbreakable spirit was no longer just staff. She was the protege. She was the one the boss had burned the world for. She entered Jinho's office without knocking. He was standing by the window, looking out over the sprawling gray carpet of Seoul. The room smelled of cold rain and the same sandalwood cologne that had haunted her dreams for 3 nights. He turned as she entered, his eyes scanning her face for any trace of the trauma he had witnessed. He found only steel. A faint, genuine smile touched the corners of his mouth, a look that would have terrified his competitors. "You're early," he remarked, his voice a warm caress. "The logistics of the Q4 audit won't wait for a broken bone, sir," Elena replied, her tone professional but laced with a new, intimate confidence. She walked to his desk and set down a tablet, her movements fluid and sure. "And the senator's father has been quiet. I assume the leverage you found was effective." She watched him, noting the way his pupils dilated as she approached. The power imbalance was still there, a yawning chasm of wealth and violence, but the bridge between them was built on a foundation of absolute trust. Jin-ho moved closer, the space between them shrinking until she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. He reached out and touched the edge of her sling, his fingers trailing down the carbon fiber. "The senator has retired to his country estate," Jin-ho said quietly. He found that his son's extracurricular activities were a liability to his career. He won't be a problem again. None of them will. He looked into her eyes, and for a moment, the monster was gone, replaced by a man who was desperately, dangerously devoted. "Are you afraid of me, Elena?" Elena didn't blink. She thought of the 15 men who were gone. She thought of the pain in the loading bay and the way Jin-ho had held her hand while she bled. She thought of the future that was now spread out before her like a golden map. "No," she said, her voice a firm, clear bell. "I think the world should be afraid of you. But I think I'm the only person who knows what you're actually capable of." She stepped into his space, her good hand finding the lapel of his jacket. "And I think I like it." Jin-ho's hand moved to the nape of her neck, his thumb tracing the curve of her ear. The kiss was inevitable, a collision of two broken worlds finding a strange, violent harmony. It tasted of expensive scotch and the salt of a lingering victory. As Elena melted into him, she felt the last of her old life fall away like autumn leaves. She was no longer the maid. She was no longer the victim. She was the woman at the right hand of the dragon, and together, they would ensure that no one ever dared to lay a finger on what belonged to them. The city below continued its frantic, oblivious crawl, but high above the streets, in the glass and steel heart of the empire, a new power had been forged. It was absolute. It was final.